Diagweave. I wrote a letter into the Irish Times yesterday. I won't say it was a rebuttal to an article that they had in their online newspaper, but it was maybe a counterpoint, or it was not even that, but I think it was a point that needed to be made. Their own article was referring to a report that showed that negative attitudes to immigration in Ireland tended to be from places that didn't experience immigration, such as rural areas, remote areas, rural areas, and also from poorer areas. And it also said that there was no evidence that poorer areas were experiencing higher rates of immigration settlement than more affluent areas. And I'm not in a position to refute that, and I don't think I would anyway, but why I wrote my letter is because I've noticed something very worrying in the last few years, I would say, couple of years. But I noticed it as far back as, I think it was 2006, there was riots in Dublin. And there was riots in Dublin because a group of people from Northern Ireland, was commonly referred to as Orange Men, were allowed march through Dublin along O'Connell Street, the main street of Dublin. And at the time they were widening the streets of there's O'Connell Street in Dublin is a very wide street, and there's an island going up the middle, wide footpaths on each side of the street. The street must be 100 metres wide. It's very wide, and the wide footpaths on either side, and an island going all along the middle. Basically, another very wide footpath going down the middle of the street, and they were in the process of widening that and bringing. I think there was 2 lanes of traffic on each side of the street, and they were widening the middle island and bringing the traffic down to 1 lane on either side. And they let these Orange Men and activists, loyalist activists these are pro-British activists, basically march down O'Connell Street as a kind of outreach to show them that Ireland isn't the cold house for you. That was the justification. Our Minister for Justice, Michael McDowell, allowed this, and Michael McDowell was he regarded himself, I think, more than anything as some sort of giant intellectual, but many people saw him that way, and he stupidly allowed this march, especially as because they were widening, they were doing work on the street, there was building material all over the place. So what happened was, when they tried to have the march, youth from all over the inner city came in. Young Dubliners came in from all over the city, but particularly the inner city areas, and rioted, wouldn't let them down the street, which was very predictable. Almost 20 years later, 18 years later, in November the 23rd, 2023, I can remember the date easily because it would have been my father's birthday, where he's still alive. And my father, there was an age gap, 15-year age gap between my father and mother. So my father was 51 when he was a mature father, I'll put it that way. Good father, mature father, and he, if he had been alive, he would have been 100 years of age on the date of November 23rd, 2023. And what happened on November the 23rd, 2023 was in the afternoon, an Algerian man stabbed multiple people in Parnell Square, and he harmed 3 children and their teacher, at least 3 children, and a couple of members of the public intervened and stopped him. But that triggered another wave of violence in Dublin, huge riots in the city centre. And it was very fortunate that one of the people that stopped him was another immigrant, a Brazilian. And if that hadn't been the case, it would have made a dark situation very much more darker in my view. And this is very close to my heart. I'm not a Dubliner. I'm from Waterford, which is 100 miles, 160 kilometres south of Dublin. But my father's a Dubliner, and where this stabbing happened was actually on one side of Parnell Square, and my father was. The stabbing happened on the eastern side of Parnell Square. My father, the house he grew up in, was on the western side of Parnell Square. And my father's house, I didn't know this, the house he grew up in was Michael Collins, which was Ireland's warrior prince basically during the War of Independence against the British. When there was an event in Irish history called Bloody Sunday, where Michael Collins, he was a de facto leader of the Irish Republican Army in the 20s during the War of Independence. He wasn't the actual leader. I think that was Cathal Brugha, a man named Cathal Brugha. But Michael Collins was he was a strategist. He was actually a finance minister in the provisional government, I think, and but he was the de facto military leader. And he organised an attack on a group of men, British spies, British intelligence officers nicknamed the Cairo Gang, who were sent to Dublin to deal with the IRA. And Michael Collins got the information of their whereabouts and sent a team of assassins called Collins Squad, some also called the 12 Apostles. That's what I learned in school, to basically assassinate these men, and they did. This happened in 1920. The British retaliated in an event. This is the first Bloody Sunday. There was another Bloody Sunday in Northern Ireland in the 70s, but this was the first one. And in retaliation, the result of these assassinations, it was mixed. They didn't get them all, but they got a good number of them, and Collins' men got a good number of these British intelligence officers. But the British the British security services, the British military, retaliated later in the afternoon at a football match a Gaelic football match in Crow Park in Dublin. Crow Park in Dublin is the biggest stadium in Ireland, but it wasn't then. It was just like a football pitch with the most they would have had was small basic wooden stands with the American planks of wood to sit on, this type of stuff. And the British went in there and killed a lot of people, opened fire on the crowds, killed a lot of people. I can't remember how many, but killed and injured a lot of people. And the stands in Crow Park now, Crow Park now is it's a big stadium. It's the 4th largest in Europe, and the stands are named after after the people that were killed. And one of them, it's a terrace where you stand. There's no seats there, I think. Maybe they are now, but that's called Hill 16, which was built on the rubble of the 1916 Rising, allegedly, apparently. So when that happened, when Bloody Sunday happened, the British forces were looking for Collins, and Collins hid was the government's headquarters. It was in Parnell Square in a hotel called Vaughan's Hotel, and Collins knew it would be raided, and he was watching the raids on Vaughan's Hotel from the house that my father was brought up in. Also, a lot of in that area, Parnell Square, there's a lot of buildings that were associated with the government in waiting, the provisional government. So Ireland hadn't won independence yet. The war was ongoing. The trajectory was heading towards Irish independence. It was de facto independent. The Irish nationalists had basically won most of the local government in the local elections, and they were abstaining in the national elections. At the time, we were electing Parliament to the Westminster Parliament in London, but they abstained from that, and they held up a provisional government in not Leinster House, in the Mansion House in Dublin. That's where the Lord Mayor of Dublin resides, I think. So that was the first Parliament. But Parnell Square was the provisional government's their base. Basically, there was a lot of buildings there, and there was a lot of buildings rented out by the Gaelic League, Conrad na Gael, that were trying to revive the Irish language. And basically the government, the nationalist hinterland, was basically all around. The Sinn Féin had their offices there, they still do. There was a lot of, that part of Dublin is basically where the provisional government, the nationalist provisional government were located. The government in waiting for independent Ireland. So the reason I'm talking about this is because it needs to be highlighted that this part of Dublin where this attack on children happened in 2023 is symbolically important. And the other reason it became it's close to my heart, it was this school that the children were attending. It was an Irish language school, and called Calash de Murra. And my father went to this school. It was on the other side of Parnell Square at the time when my father went there, but it was a bigger school. It was the main school, and all that's left now in Parnell Square is this kind of nursery school or preschool, something like this, where the attack occurred. And that's in the aftermath of the attack on these children, the mood shift, the government condemnation shifted from very, very quickly from the attack to the riots. The riots were condemned and blah blah. Yeah, it's the usual stuff. There's no room for this in modern Ireland and stuff like this. The children were actually quickly forgotten. I don't condone the riots, by the way. I don't think they were helpful, but I think it would be very naive to pretend that it's not understandable what happened. And like I said in my earlier video, it's self-evident now that there's a housing crisis, very severe one in Ireland, and particularly bad bad everywhere, but Dublin, it's bad. In the aftermath of the riots, there was a lot of online commentary condemning the riots, which is, I suppose, to be expected. But what seems to have escaped a lot of people, not me, and I'm sure not other people too, is the rhetoric around the rioters was basically very disparaging. Okay, now I know I can understand people can not liking the riots and condemning them, but people that I would say would describe themselves as progressives would make some incredibly disparaging remarks. For example, often referring to people who, in their minds, people from the inner city, who in their minds were rioting. And this is a poor part of Dublin. despite it being in the city centre. People in their minds from the inner city, they would use disparaging terms like pissheads, basically alcoholics, right, and similar terms. And I've noticed this more and more, and it reached a crescendo. It's starting to reach a kind of crescendo because there's more and more anti-immigration riots in Ireland. Not riots, anti-immigration protests. Since the big Dublin riots, the big riots in Dublin in 2023, there hasn't been really any more. There may have been some moderate ones, but there's been violence in the form of buildings being set on fire and stuff like this, where people think refugees are going to be housed. This happened up in Coolock. There was riots up in Coolock, in a northern suburb of Dublin. But each and every time something happens, or if somebody protests, even if it's peacefully, it generates this very negative rhetoric online. Now, I came across a term in the last few days when I was doing some research for this, out of a term called a deficit ideology. So a deficit ideology is basically an ideology that says somebody is less than. So people from Africa are less than. That would be a deficit. So let's say the white man's burden. That would be a definite deficit ideology, because it assumes that the white man is superior and is somehow destined to be the patrons of the brown-skinned people. In other words, racism. Manifest destiny, all those 19th century insane where the Anglo-Saxon is superior, the Englishman is superior. And the Irish would be very familiar with these deficit ideologies. But in my letter to the Irish Times, I basically said I'd noticed these common terms about poor people from the inner city who are protesting about immigration, and they all have a common sort of trope, smackhead, implying that they're heroin addicts, and some of them would be crackheads sometimes, dole heads. So in other words, they don't work, they're unemployed, they're all on the dole heads. And what's the other one? Oh, and this is the ironic one, cream crackers. A cream cracker is a rhyming slang for I don't even know if I can say it if this goes up on YouTube. It's rhyming slang for a word spelled Knacker, and that word describes a person who engages in an informal trade called knackering that involves the slaughter of sick animals for farmers and stuff like this. And that's a derogatory term for a gypsy or a travelling person in Ireland. Person that's a traveller. So, and again, it's incredible to see these people who would see themselves, in my mind at least, they would see themselves as progressive, using this term cream cracker. And it begs the question, who are the real bigots here? Who are the real bigots? Are the people who, maybe I'm assuming wrongly, are relatively privileged, who are possibly benefiting from the world as it is? Maybe they're okay in life, maybe they have somewhere to live, Maybe they have a career. Maybe they might be housed. They might not be on the property ladder, but maybe it's within reach. And the disparaging of the poor in this way is another deficit ideology, and that's my gripe, basically. So we have to find a way to reconcile this. There's no point in... And when my father was born in 1923, Dublin was famous for tenements. I have a book there. I gave it to my father as a birthday present once. It's called Dublin Tenement Life, and I bought it for him a long time ago. And when he died, my mother, I took it back, basically, because it's a nice book. It's a value. There's nice information in there. And when my father was born, even though he wasn't in poor circumstances, his father had a nice job. The house I mentioned earlier, where Michael Collins watched the raids on Vaughan Hotel, where my father grew up, where my father grew up, basically. This was a nice house. It was a large townhouse, but he was surrounded by houses very similar that were divided up into tenements. And he used to tell me about them, and there were very dire circumstances. The people that lived there. There was high mortality rates with their children. Dublin, there was a big area in Dublin called the Monto, where a lot of these rioters are from now. And the Monto, there's places like one street is called Killarney Street, one street is called Waterford Street. There is some parts of these places have consistently remained poor, even through independence. And it just doesn't seem fair that the people that seem to be having the most to lose out of the economic system we have are getting disparaged in this way. It just doesn't sit. It doesn't seem like it just. It makes our society look very unjust, because I can't help thinking that if something did happen in Ireland, if Ireland did find itself in a very unstable situation and a war, and I'm talking about a war or something like this, these are the type of people who would try and step up to the plate. And I can't help imagining that in 1916, in the revolutionary period, as Tom Garvin, the historian, calls it, say 1912 to 1923, these are the people who joined the ranks of the IRA and the Irish Citizens Army back then. These were in a very famous event in Ireland's history, during the revolutionary period, the Dublin lockout. These were the grandparents and great grandparents of these people that are probably living in this area that rioted in 2023. And I have to say, what I forgot to say was this: there used to be, when my father was born, there was a huge area to the east of O'Connell Street in Dublin called the Monto, and it was Dublin. It was a huge red light district, the biggest one in Europe, and it kind of represented Ireland's role in the British Empire. There was a book written called Strumpet City by, what's his name, was it James Plunkett? Second name was Plunkett, I can't remember his first name. And a strumpet is a word for a prostitute, sex worker. And the Strumpet City was Dublin, you see. and a lot of the locations, some of the characters in Strumpet City, I think, if I remember, I didn't read the book, or they made a television miniseries of it in the 80s, and it did the Monto Red Light District did feature in it, I believe. And it also showed the hypocrisy of what are called castle Catholics, you know. The castle Catholics are Irish Catholics that, while ethnically they were Irish, and they were basically loyal to the empire. They had privileged status, privileged lives. And there's one character, there's a parade in Dublin at the time, and when Strumpet City is... Strumpet City, I think, is set during the lockout. The lockout was, there was a general strike in Dublin, and the industrialists and newspaper people, the docks, they were all... the workers were for striking, they were locked out of their jobs. And the castle Catholics were people who had vested interests. They had money, and there's a scene in the TV series where there's the mini-series where there's a military parade, and you had all these Irish regiments in the British Army marching. And this castle Catholic has a view of the parade from his house, his townhouse. Probably not unlike my father's house that he grew up in. And he's there, he sees the Royal Dublin Fusiliers is the name of the regiment. They're marching past his house, and he goes, "Come on the Dubs." This is the way he's going, you see. But it's a British Army regiment despite its name. And it makes me wonder, do people need to reflect a bit more? Is your privileged life making you like the castle Catholics? Despite having all the radical chic ideas, you see? And that's where I'm coming to with the radical chic. Are progressives actually concerned with justice?